Today we'll be replacing the hex brass bearings on a 979-2, and the tools needed will be a 9/16 socket on either an impact or a ratchet, a ball peen or claw hammer, a 532 punch, a 5/16 punch, a 3/16 Allen, and a 1/8 Allen. So before we lock out, tag out the machine, we will manually jog the movable carriage down as far as we can go while still allowing access to this bearing here. Roughly 5 or 6 inches is more than sufficient. And once that is done, you can follow your company's proper lockout, tag out procedures for both air and electrical. Once the movable head is in position, we'll be removing this retainment cap off of the hex shaft with our 9/16 socket. So now that the air has been turned off and the safety guard here has been removed, we are able to manually push the feed back and forth, and this allows the hex shaft to rotate so that we can align the cam lock gear down here and access the set screw and release it. For the next step, we will be releasing the lock ring here. So we'll use the 1/8 inch Allen and loosen the set screw and then loosen the lock ring, and that allows the hex shaft to come out. There's also 2 more bearings with a similar locking style that we will have to release. So the way that these locking bearings work is there's a concentric outer ring on the bearing itself, and then this lock ring here that drops in, and it lines up concentrically to get the shaft through, and then once it's positioned correctly, you lock this in place, and you can see how it cams, and this ring would lock the shaft in place, and then you would tighten the set screw here to keep this component from releasing and unlocking. Next, we'll be removing this lock ring that was just demonstrated. So we'll use our 3/16 Allen to crack that loose, and then another one. This bolt does not need to be all the way removed. And then next, we'll bring this around until this hole lines up, and we'll use a punch and our hammer to bust it loose. Well, this one has already been loosened for demonstration, but it'll be a lot tighter. So you'll get it started with your hammer and your punch, and if you need, you can always wedge your punch in there and then use a channel ox or a crescent wrench to kind of move it around and move the ring until it pops off. As you can see, it has now been released from the ring on the bearing. Now we will be repeating the same process that was just performed on the movable side. Next, we'll be removing the guard underneath the fixed side head, and we'll do that by removing these 2 bolts. This is done with a 7/16 gear wrench, or a socket and ratchet would also work. And this guard has to be removed so that we can slide the hex shaft out underneath this head, which will be performed in the next step. So now that the locking bearings are released and the guard has been removed, we will be removing the hex shaft underneath the fixed head to the operator left. So this should just slide out And you want to support this brass piece, make sure it doesn't fall out, and then we'll just continue out underneath that head. We'll continue removing the hex shaft. Due to the length of the hex shaft, there needs to be at least 8.5 feet of clearance between this edge of the form section and the end of the hex shaft in order to get it out. If there's not clearance due to a wall or a rack of material, then the shaft will have to be removed out the other side, which we will show next. So if you do need to go out the other side, unfortunately this bearing will have to be removed because the hex shaft is machined down to a round circle to fit inside the bearing, and the hex cannot go through the round bearing. So you'll have to remove this bearing and then slide the shaft off of it slightly, pull the bearing out of the way, and then the hex shaft can come through this clearance hole. It is less than ideal to do this, but again, if you have clearance issues on the other side, it's the only way to do it. And when everything gets reassembled, the location of this bearing will have to be reset. So the teeth on the gear hit this plate and prevent it from being removed. So I'll be using a piece of Delrin, or you can use a small piece of wood or a piece of scrap trim, any non-marring substance. And I'll just be kind of tapping the bearing until it gets into a position where this gear and this brass assembly will come out of the bearing. And now we'll be repeating the same process on the other side. So with the hex shaft removed and the air turned off, the feed system is able to move freely. And as you can see, this is the fixed side, which is moving. And without the hex shaft in, the movable side is not moving at all. So it is possible when this is being reassembled that the feed system loses its timing. So what we're gonna do is turn the air back on to get these to retract fully into their retracted positions. And then when we mesh the new gear in with the rack on the bottom of this assembly, we know that the feed system is timed correctly. And when the air gets turned on, you'll see the feed system retract, and the movable side will do the same, and then they will be timed correctly. Now that the air has been turned back on and the feed system is timed, we will be inserting the new brass gear. And it's worth noting that the lock ring for the bearing will be reused, which slides over the brass like that. And then we'll insert the new brass bearing into the bearing, and then reuse the same tools as before to seat that up into the gear. And when it's up tight, you want a little bit of play, just like that. Now it's time to reinstall the hex shaft by sliding it underneath the fixed head and through the brass hex bearing. Now that the hex shaft is back through, it's important to remember to put the lock ring for this last carrier bearing on the shaft before we slide it through. And make sure it's seated tight all the way against the lock ring. And that the lock ring is seated all the way against the bearing. And we'll tighten that up finally at the very end. It's important to note when installing the new gears that they should line up correctly with the rack here. As you can see, this one is seated too far to our left. So we'll want to pull this out until it hits this plate and then push it back just a little bit. Oh, too much. We don't want it rubbing on this plate as this thing is cycling back and forth, but we want to make sure we're getting good gear engagement between the gear and the rack. Now that everything's back in place, we're going to go through and tighten up all of the lock rings on the bearings and replace the retaining cap on the end of the shaft, basically reversing the sequence that we did to take everything apart. It's important that all of your fasteners and bolts are tight, and all of your guards and any parts that were removed have been put back on.